I hope you all had a blessed Easter. I hope you're all enjoying what is a beautiful and gentle spring evening. The title for tonight's presentation, The Economics of the Future, might be a little tricky or misleading. Economics isn't going to change over the centuries any more than the laws of chemistry are. When I talk about the economics of the future, I'm talking about how we today include considerations of the future in our economic activity. And what we do today can greatly impact tomorrow. Part of mankind's human action is just, is keeping an eye on the future. And a key concept, and the sociologists have done some good work on this, it's called time horizons. There are short time horizons and long time horizons. And the 20th century British economist, John Maynard Keynes, one of his most famous quips was when somebody asked him about all this deficit spending that he was advocating governments engage in. He said, well, okay, in the short run, that's one thing, but what about the long run? And of course, he threw it off by saying, in the long run, we're all dead. But the long run does have consequences. And it makes a big difference for an individual and a society's prosperity as to whether they pay attention to the future. The sociologists have found that one of the common mental attitudes or traits of poor people is that they don't pay much attention to the future. They live very much in the now. And I know that's supposed to be psychologically healthy, but economically it can be very short-sighted and harmful. So they don't think about the rainy day. They don't bother to save up for the unforeseen events or exigencies or anything else. And there's one other class of people besides poor people that have short time horizons: politicians. You think of the conduct of so many of our politicians of either party. What's their number one concern and focal point? Getting reelected, which is maybe like next year. So they often vote on issues on the basis of how it's going to appear to people in the short run, even if the long-term effects are known to be negative. But they kick the can down the road. They say, well, that'll be somebody else's problem. But I think it's interesting that poor people and politicians have that commonality, because it kind of suggests that maybe politicians have a tendency to make us poorer than we would otherwise be. Sounds a little bit cynical, but I've seen enough evidence of it to believe in that. The idea of deferring present gratification in order to enjoy more in the future, that was a key component of the German sociologist Max Weber. Weber is the German pronunciation, is W-E-B-E-R. And he was writing around 1900, so over a century ago. But he's the one that developed his theory of the Protestant work ethic. And that was, of course, to work hard, but also to be frugal, to practice thrift, to save up for the rainy day. And he said that is the key to the wealthier societies, that the people are imbued with this Protestant work ethic. And indeed, in American history, earlier generations were known for their thrift. And thrift has a way of enriching both individuals and society. If you don't consume all your present income and instead save it, that income can be capital that you invest, and it grows. It's an insurance policy. Before we had government trying to take care of this and that and the other thing for us, people were pretty much dependent on their own resources or those of people who might care enough to reach out to them, but it required some savings, the proverbial fund for the rainy day. And besides the ability of savings to be converted into capital that can multiply and grow and make one richer so that one has a much higher standard of living after several decades of of savings, that capital becomes part of the capital pool of a society. And it doesn't matter if a government practices some degree of socialism or is very laissez-faire free market. It's just an economic fact of life that you have to have capital. I mean, even the kind of Soviet Union, they couldn't consume everything. They had to hold some of it back to build machinery, to build weapons or whatever it was they wanted to build. They weren't very good at providing or producing consumer goods, that's for sure. But capital is just an economic fact of life. It's one of the factors of production, and no ideology can obliterate that economic truth. The inducement, or one of the main inducements for people to defer present gratification and to save, is interest. It's the idea that $1 today is worth more than $1 in the future. And the economic function of interest is to coordinate economic activity over time. And so it's like, should we just consume all that we have today? Well, maybe. It depends on the circumstances. But a lot of times it just makes more sense in the long run to defer, and that interest accumulates, and that's how you get more. The problem is, what happens if you're living in an inflationary era, such as we have been living in recently, and we're living in back in the 70s to a great degree? It doesn't make sense to save. I mean, there's less incentive to save, because it's like, well, if you sit on your money, it's like, ice cream sitting out on a picnic table in the July sun. It's going to melt away. And so, we'll talk more about inflation a little bit later on here. But certainly, if you spend more today, there's less capital accumulated for the society, and therefore there will be less production in the future. So what's the opposite of savings? Borrowing, going into debt. And debt often impoverishes people. Sometimes the idea, consume it today, worrying about paying for it tomorrow. I think our society has kind of adopted that approach. A lot of people do that. They just worry about paying for it later. But that's going to impoverish their future, because what they'll find is the interest payments, whether it's home mortgage or auto payment or credit card or whatever, part of their future stream of income, they're not going to be able to spend on things they want to enjoy then. They're going to pay for prior consumption, past consumption. So it's kind of burning your future before you get there, trying to have your cake and eat it too. Let me just give you some figures here so you can kind of begin to grasp how deeply embedded in our society is this tendency to go into debt, to borrow. You realize historically, Old Testament and stuff, what happened if people couldn't pay their debts? Well, their children went into slavery, and that was denounced by Nehemiah. That was the usury that he objected to. But even, the 1800s, Charles Dickens in the poorhouses of London, going into debt can be a way to compromise your future freedom. And we today in America are debt addicts. And I'm not saying that about any of you individually. I think a lot of people who kind of have this connection with Grove City College understand the importance of savings, of trying not to go into debt. But collectively in America right now, I got figures. Some of them are 2 or 3 months old. Some might be 6 months old. But auto loans are now over $1.5 trillion. College loans are over $1.75 trillion. Credit card debt is almost $1 trillion. Corporations they're in debt. They have borrowed more than $22.5 trillion. And then, of course, you've got the king of all borrowers, dear old Uncle Sam, $31.6 trillion. And it's really more than that. I mean, there are these off-budget items, and I didn't research what the current amounts are there, but we really owe more than 31.6 trillion. And that doesn't even take into account what we call our unfunded liabilities, the promises of future payments in Social Security and Medicare, et cetera. And that can be, according to your time frame, it can be several times the $31 trillion. So they're just astronomical amounts of debt out there. I guess we can say Americans have become a debt addicted society. And there's kind of a, it's kind of seeped into our culture. And, when I talked earlier about time preferences, I can remember as an undergraduate student spending a couple of summers in Mexico. And that's where I really started to see real poverty. I mean, I caught glimpses of it going down to the inner city of Detroit to see a baseball game. We go through some poor neighborhoods. So I knew a little bit about poverty, but I'm talking about poverty where people couldn't afford shoes and, were dressed in tatters and so on and so forth. And yet there's a cultural tradition in Mexico called the quinceañera. It's the celebration of the 15th birthday of a daughter in a family. And it was not uncommon, according to a good friend who was my professor and a native Mexican. He said a family in Mexico could spend half of its savings on that one party, that one occasion, the 15th birthday party of a daughter. I mean, they really love their daughters, but it's like, in the long run, not the most prudent economic move. Now, maybe that's being judgmental. I'm not saying it's wrong. That's their culture, and it does help to explain why they're relatively poor. They're not that good at saving. Well, let me get into a little bit of the history of our government debt. The founding fathers understood the dangers of debt. They abhorred debt. They didn't want any. They were stuck with it. I mean, fighting the Revolutionary War was expensive. And of course, Alexander Hamilton's the one that came up with the plan for the new federal government to honor all the war debts, at least to some extent. And I think the consensus attitude was articulated by Thomas Jefferson, as was so often the case. What a genius. But he said that the idea of a government spending more money than current taxpayers were willing to fund, in other words, borrowing for current spending, imposing that debt on future taxpayers. He called it swindling futurity on a large scale. It was morally repugnant to the founders. And for generations, the consensus agreement, regardless of the political party, was Uncle Sam will only go into debt for extreme circumstances such as war or the Louisiana Purchase or the Alaska Purchase. But I mean, for daily operations, for taking care of citizens economically, no, that wasn't part of the function of the US government. And when you think about it, Jefferson and the other founders were being very consistent in that idea of not imposing a debt burden on their children, on the succeeding generation. Because when you think about it, that would be a form of taxation without representation, which was one of the main reasons and justifications for fighting the Revolutionary War. That the British Parliament wasn't giving American colonists a say in the laws that governed them. They would tax them, but the Americans couldn't vote on it. Well, minors aren't allowed to vote. They have nothing to do with deficit spending. But as the years go by and the minors become adults, as citizens, they're responsible for a share of that national debt. So it's a very un-American concept, at least in the traditional historical sense of what it is for American, to be an American. Little trivia, there's only one president under whose leadership the national debt was essentially retired. There was absolutely no interest-bearing debt. I know the official figure was $33,000. Can you imagine the total debt of the United States today being $33,000? Instead of 31 trillion. Wow. And that was under President Andrew Jackson in the mid-1830s. But it's been very difficult for Americans to stay out of debt completely. Of course, the Civil War plunged us into debt, and you had Spanish American War, and then World War I, and so on and so forth, and World War II. But generally speaking, in peacetime, Americans of both major parties in the 20th century tried very hard not to go into debt for a while. That changed under Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt. To back up a little, the slippery slope might have started in the 1800s with a little bit of cronyism. Now, let me implore you, friends, if you ever hear someone use the term crony capitalism, don't use it yourself, because that makes no more sense than liquid ice. It's an oxymoron. It's an attempt by the left, as they're always trying to do, is to besmirch and discredit capitalism. But capitalism, properly understood, simply means the free market. It means that we, the people, the citizens, we decide which companies prosper and which ones fail by virtue of what we choose to buy, whose businesses we choose to patronize. It's under socialism that the government decides which business enterprises go on, because the government props them up. Cronyism is and has been for decades a problem in our society. We don't have pure capitalism. We do have cronyism. But if you understand that cronyism repudiates capitalism, because cronyism means the government vacates its role, its traditional role in America in a free market economy of being the impartial referee who's not tilting the table in favor of any particular economic actor. And all of a sudden the government intervenes in the economy and starts choosing winners and losers and subsidizes these folks. And then, when we got the 16th Amendment in 1913, started taxing these folks, so that's when the redistribution of wealth started. But that wasn't historically the case. Minor interruption here. I'm hearing some background noise. If any of you participating in this, maybe have your mute off. Could you please mute it? Thank you. Appreciate that. A few businesses did finagle subsidies from government in the 1800s. There's a great book by a historian who's a good friend of Grove City College, Bert Folsom, F-O-L-S-O-M. Bert wrote a book, I bet it's been 30 years ago now, The Myth of the Robber Barons. The standard progressive take on the Gilded Age is that the very successful capitalists like Vanderbilt and Carnegie and Rockefeller and all those guys, they were the bad guys. The interesting thing that Bert found out, though, was that generally speaking, the entrepreneurs who made it big did so without the help of government, in marked contrast to many of the business people who got government subsidies and ended up going broke. For example, there were 4 transcontinental railroads, and only I think it was the Great Northern of James Hill was the only one that didn't get government subsidies. It's also the only one that didn't go bankrupt. So the maligning of the successful entrepreneur is very unjust, and really what should have been denounced was the cronyism, where less efficient entrepreneurs would waste taxpayer dollars by running businesses inefficiently. Well, in the 20th century, we accepted a much larger role for government. It started kind of gradually. You might say it started with our involvement in World War I, and Herbert Hoover was put in charge of organizing our farms to supply the emergency food to our European allies. And Hoover, who was a decent man and an engineer by trade, He just said, okay, we put this here and we put that there. That's kind of how socialists think, though. They think of the economy as a machine instead of really grasping the spontaneous order that arises from free voluntary exchange. We had our last hurrah of the free market under Presidents Harding and Coolidge after World War I. There's a horrible depression in 1921. I think the GDP fell something like 23% or 24% in half a year. I mean, it was the most severe and rapid decline in history, even greater than the Great Depression. And we never hear about it because it lasted such a short time. We also don't hear about it because progressives don't like to admit that Warren Harding, whatever his personal foibles may have been, and we can compare him to the picadillos and the errors of some of his fellow presidents, but that the big picture here should just be his economic policy, and it might have been the most successful economic policy of the 20th century, because what he did in his first 2 years in office is he cut federal spending by more than 40%. Think of that. He almost cut government spending in half. And in that second year, unemployment was down to from over 11% to under 3%. And the economy was booming. And it launched the Roaring 20s. The progressive historians and economists don't want you to know that the free market healed the most severe depression in American history in a very short time. Well, 1928 election comes. Harding had died in 23. Coolidge succeeded him, was reelected in 24, chose not to run for reelection in 28. Hoover ran, and the Republicans held office because the 20s was such a prosperous decade. Why rock the boat? But Hoover did rock the boat. He was an interventionist to his core. He was a progressive. He was Republican, but he wasn't a free market Republican like Harding and Coolidge. And he cut his teeth working under Woodrow Wilson, managing American agriculture in the war effort. And so what happened with the stock market crash, which was precipitated by stupid Federal Reserve policy, and we don't need to go into all that right now. But what happened with Hoover's response to the Depression was intervention after intervention after intervention, more and more government involvement, more and more government spending, and all of a sudden, it wasn't a war, but he was going deeper into debt. And Franklin Roosevelt campaigned against him in 1932 and said, this guy's practically a socialist. Elect me and I'll cut spending 25%. So he gets elected and he boosts spending and he continues the deficit spending and he expands the deficit spending. And several years later, Keynes comes out with his book and says, hey, you're doing the right thing. So he continues his deficit spending. And we never got out of the Depression until the 40s. It was just one policy blunder after another. But what they had in common was you had the government spending money that it didn't have yet, taking on huge amounts of debt that somebody else was going to have to worry about later, and messing up with the free motions of a free market economy. Well, also, this is politically significant. 1936 was probably a key turning point. It was when Roosevelt ran for re-election the first time. And there were a lot of Americans, and you can read about this in another book by Bert Folsom. And the guy's a great writer. I think you'd enjoy his books if you have any interest at all. The earlier book about the rich, successful entrepreneurs is called The Myth of the Robber Barons. His book about FDR's New Deal was called New Deal or Raw Deal, and it was a raw deal. And it was Roosevelt who inaugurated a political practice which has only become more and more entrenched and more expansive in the decades since. And that was the strategic deployment of federal funds, that he would take our tax dollars and he would make sure that they got spent in areas where he needed votes. Because in the middle of 1936, people thought that the Republican Alf Landon might have a good chance to win because people were looking around and saying, doggone, the economy is in no better shape now than it was 4 years ago. But I probably should vote for Roosevelt because his WPA or his, CCC or whatever, the alphabet soup of agencies that he created, they're employing my Uncle Harry. So I guess, I don't want to pull the economic rug out from Uncle Harry. So I guess I'll vote for Roosevelt. And in one of the more shameful aspects of Roosevelt's cynical spending was, if it was really designed to alleviate poverty, a lot of that federal aid, and I'm using quotation marks because it didn't really help a whole lot, but it seemed to kind of put a short-term Band-Aid on things, but it didn't really fix the economy. But he should have sent most of that money to the Deep South. That's where the human suffering was the most aggravated. He didn't. Why? Well, you see, there was this civil war in the 1860s, and Lincoln and the Union won. We all know that. And what party was that? Well, that was the Republicans. So for generations in the Deep South, Republicans couldn't win any elections. It's only been in the last, 40 years or so that, because of the cultural conservatism of the South, that Republicans have started to get elected, being the more conservative of the two parties. But in the 1930s, it was a foregone conclusion that when these poor Southerners went into the voting booth, they were going to pull the lever for the Democrats, because they just despised the Republicans because of the Civil War. They blamed them for the Civil War. So Roosevelt said, well, I'm not going to waste spending these federal dollars on the Deep South. So he made sure that his heads of bureaucratic administrators spent a lot of that money in swing states, Pennsylvania being one, California being another, and he ended up with a landslide. And ever since then, government has used the dollars they tax from you and me to stroke certain constituencies, to do favors, to have them beholden to them for electoral purposes. It's basically, for politicians are for sale, political prostitution, if you want to call it that. But it's endemic. It's just the way things work now. And of course, it accelerated under Lyndon Baines Johnson, the war on poverty. And that finally, after that, I think that's when the dam started to weaken. And I'm talking about the dam that was holding back deficit spending. There was deficit spending, but even under Roosevelt, we never got up to like trillions. I mean, the number trillion, I've told you about that in a previous lecture, how huge trillion is compared to billion. If a billion is going from Pittsburgh to St. Louis, a trillion is going to the moon and back a couple of times and more. And that's the scale we're talking about. Well, with the war on poverty and with the triumph of the progressive ideology that the federal government's job was to take care of people economically, and of course, you see the problem there, there's no end to it. I mean, if you're going to take care of their health care, why don't you take care of their education and their housing and their transportation? It goes on and on. If you're going to help Mr. A, Mr. B, and Mr. C, why not Mr. X, Y, and Z? So the dam broke. U.S. debt surpassed $1 trillion for the first time during the Reagan administration in 1982. And I can remember 10 years later in 1992, I was working with Dr. Senholtz out in New York at the Foundation for Economic Education, which is now based in Atlanta. Good organization, fee.org, FEE.org, if you want a source of some really clear thinking. FEE was run for a number of years, until a few years ago, by Larry Reed, Grove City College class of 1975, another Senholtz student like I am. Larry's a brilliant writer, and you can get all sorts of stuff for free on FEE, including, I touted the books of Bert Folsom. Let me tout the books of a late professor of history who was at Grove City College for a short time in the late 60s, the late Clarence B. Carson. And I was very influenced when I was first studying economics by his books. He was a professor of intellectual history, and he sort of traced the evolution of these ideas that gave rise to our practice of big government today. And one of his books, one of his better books, is available free as a PDF on fee.org. It's called The Flight from Reality. So again, for those of you who just looking for something to read by a writer who, you know, I think writes pretty interesting prose, Clarence B. Carson, The Flight from Reality, fee.org. Okay, so I'm working with Dr. Sennholz at FEE, 1992, and I was stunned. Under George H.W. Bush, that $1 trillion debt from 1982 in 10 years had become $4 trillion. And I remember writing an editorial. I wrote a weekly editorial, among other things, for FEE, and I lamented that. And I wasn't sure how we'd ever get out of that debt hole. Would have been possible, but that's a whole lot of money to expect people to pay back politically, because, you know, I guess while I would criticize both parties, I do think our deficit spending has been bipartisan. In fact, I can remember getting in my car in the parking lot after class at Grove City one day. This was in about 2008 or 9. It was right when Obama was getting elected. And I happened to turn on the Hannity radio show, and one of his callers was saying, do you realize that 3/4 of the federal debt was accumulated under Republican presidents? And Hannity blew a gasket and called the guy a liar right there on the air. And he was wrong, and his caller was right. 3/4 of the debt then was under Republican presidents. And when George W. Bush and Donald Trump, both of them had a part of their presidency where Congress was in the hands of the Republican Party. So you had the whole government in the hands of the Republican Party, and the budget deficits went up instead of down. The only way I can exonerate these people from some of their responsibility is that I think we, the people, have forced them to do that, because Americans have come to expect government subsidies, whether it be to business, cronyism, or whether it be to various classes of individuals, college students, retirees, people needing medical care, whatever. You know, all of us like to get something for nothing. It's human nature. And we view government as Santa Claus. But we don't like it when government taxes us. So what's the message to politicians? Spend money on these Americans. You'll probably get their vote. But don't tax them, because you'll probably lose their vote. So you can see the incentives are in favor of spending and against taxation. That's a perfect formula for running budget deficits and having the national debt continue to grow. Now, it was only in the 10 years from 92 to 2002, the budget only went up a couple trillion, it was 6 trillion. We kind of had a perfect storm in the late 90s when Gingrich was the Speaker of the House and Clinton was the president. And it was the end of the Cold War, so they could dial back military spending somewhat. They had a stock market boom that was throwing off a lot of capital gains tax revenue. They had welfare reform so that there was less spending on people not working and more people working and paying taxes. You know, a lot of good things happened. And yet at the end of the 10-year period, you still were up with $2 more trillion of debt to 6 trillion. So we went from $6 trillion of national debt in 2002 to 16 in 2012. We went up $10 trillion, more than doubled it in 10 years. And then let's go another 10 years in the future to last year, 2022. And we're up from 16 to $30 trillion. This is an unsustainable pace, folks. Even Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, made a statement, public statement to that effect recently. This is mind-boggling. It's totally unpayable. And it's also, we have a danger here of the government debt becoming like a black hole, because all of a sudden, with the Fed having let the inflation genie out of the bottle and having had to jack up interest rates, well, everybody who's paying interest is hurting. The higher interest rates mean fewer people can afford new homes or new cars. But it also affects Uncle Sam, because Uncle Sam has to pay interest on all the money he's borrowed. And we had a situation there during most of the 2010s under Obama and a little bit under Trump, although the interest rates started going up, but we had a multi-year policy by the Federal Reserve of, I call it ZIRP, zero interest rate policy. In other words, no difference between the value of something today and something in the future. Well, that's nonsense. In the real world, there is. But the Federal Reserve, by keeping interest rates down, they kept the government cost of servicing the debt down. And so the government said, hey, we could spend trillions more, we could borrow trillions more, and it's really not going to affect us here in the short run. There we go again. In the short run, it's not going to affect us because the interest rates are so low. So you see, I blame the Federal Reserve for enabling the runaway spending of the last decade. By artificially cramming interest rates down to zero, they depressed the cost of servicing the national debt, and that just made it easier for the spendthrifts in the White House and on Capitol Hill to just go on spending. Crazy. But now the chickens are coming home to roost. The interest rates have gone up quite a bit. The cost of servicing the national debt did start to go up under Trump. The Fed apparently didn't want to subsidize Trump the way they'd subsidized Obama. I hope that's a fair statement. I'm just looking at what happened. Interest rates went up under Trump. In 2018, it cost Uncle Sam about $500 billion, $1.5 trillion of interest on the national debt. Now, here we are in 2013. I just saw a chart from the Federal Reserve. Looks like it's about $850 billion a year servicing the national debt, almost $1 trillion a year. It'll probably hit a trillion. It depends what happens with interest rates in the coming months. But if we reach a point where maybe government revenue is $5 trillion a year, but 20 cents of every dollar goes to pay debt, that's a lot of spending that can't happen on present benefits for people because we're still paying off the interest for past benefits given out to people. And that can be a very scary thing where just people, I can't see the politicians cutting spending because that would be political suicide. So they're just going to keep having to spend more, which means they'll have to borrow more, which will push interest rates up, or they'll have to, ouch, inflate. You know, there's an old saying in economics, debts always get repaid. Sometimes they get repaid honestly, and sometimes they get repaid dishonestly by inflation. Actually, they don't always get repaid. They get settled because sometimes borrowers default. Now, we have it's going to be a little bit harsh language, but the President of the United States came out just a few weeks ago with his 10-year budget plan, and I would call it insane. It just, to me, it's economically incomprehensible. He's calling for an additional $17 trillion of debt over the next decade, which would take the national debt to what? Over $48 trillion. But our economy has been in slow growth mode for the last couple of decades, with the exception of a blip upward during the COVID inflation, but that was just for a couple of quarters. Biden's economic team, I wrote about this for the Institute for Faith and Freedom back in 2021. Biden's own economic advisors said they expected sub 2% growth for the next decade, that that's going to be the new norm. Well, at 2% growth at a time when they're calling for the debt to increase over 4% a year, the debt becomes a larger and larger. It's already 1.2 times our GDP. In 10 years, if these figures of Biden are true, it's going to be over 1.5 times our GDP. And when a country gets into that much of a pickle, sometimes the only way out is for the currency to be radically inflated. And what I really find unconscionable on the part of the president, besides this Looney Tunes budget, I mean, Jerome Powell says it's unsustainable. But also, I mean, we've got this issue with the debt ceiling, and the debt ceiling's been raised multiple times. And we go through a ritual, I call it the debt ceiling dance, where you have some fiscally conservative Republicans say, whoa, slow down. We need to cut some spending. And the Democrats dig in their heels and say, well, no, we can't hurt anybody by cutting back on their spending. And they play chicken because they get to a deadline where all of a sudden the Treasury's going to not be able to pay its bills. And it's always the Republicans that blink because they know that the Democrats will be able to demagogue the issue and blame them for the ensuing economic chaos. And yet it takes two in any negotiation. And we have the President of the United States saying he refuses to negotiate about future budgets until the Republicans say, okay, raise the debt ceiling unconditionally. You don't have to cut any spending, just raise it. And there are people in the president's party who don't want to just raise the debt limit, they want to eliminate it. And again, they're living in a fantasy world. We don't have infinite wealth, and yet they say there shouldn't be any limit on what the government borrows. Well, there should be, because the government is not going to be able to afford to pay the interest on all of this borrowing. They'll just have to print dollars. And it's the same demagoguery with reforming Social Security. You might have noticed in the last couple of weeks, there were some pretty intense riots over in France because President Macron said, look, we're going to have to raise the retirement age in the next few years from 62 to 64. And the French people were ticked off. And I can't really blame them. It's a huge disappointment if you've gone through your working career planning to retire at 62, and all of a sudden some guy in government says, sorry, changing the rules, you got to be 64. I mean, that's not nice. And yet it's not being done wickedly. It's being done because they literally don't have enough money to make the numbers add up. It's a matter of simple arithmetic. And it's the same with our retirement system. And the trustees of the Social Security system, they come out every year and they say, we're going to run out of funds by 2033, or if spending keeps increasing as fast as it has under Biden, it'll happen before 2033. Something's going to have to give. A traditional political compromise would be people on the receiving end would get a little bit less. People being taxed have to pay a little bit more. In other words, to kind of distribute the economic pain as evenly as possible. And however you do it, you're going to have some very, very angry citizens. It's not going to be a harmonious political scene. But it's inevitable, and we have to confront this. This is just simply a mathematical reality here. And so it leads us to several future scenarios. I mean, debt will feed inflation. And I'm going to make another negative comment about the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve was established for the ostensible purpose of preserving the integrity and the purchasing power of our currency. It was to protect the dollar, to defend the dollar, to make sure that holders of dollars had a currency that would hold its purchasing power. That's the whole reason the Fed exists. What's been the dominant Federal Reserve policy for probably close to a decade now? They're aiming for 2% inflation. They're above that now, which is why they raised interest rates, and we're all struggling with the burden of consumer prices going up. But if the target, I mean, think of how crazy that is. Here's an institution that's supposed to preserve the value, and their policy is, no, we're going to whittle away 2% of its purchasing power every year. You do that for 20 years, and you've gotten rid of 1/3 of the purchasing power of a dollar. Of course, compared to when the dollar, what the purchasing power of the dollar was when the Fed was created in 1913, I think it's worth 2.5 cents. In other words, our central bank has failed in its primary mission. It has not preserved the value of the dollar. And of course, as I said before, inflation discourages savings. Spend it now because it's going to be worth less tomorrow. So that's inflationary psychology that sets in, and you can have a price spiral, a race. People want to get rid of it's like the old card game Old Maid. You're trying to get rid of the old maid. Well, when the dollar becomes the old maid, that's not good for an economy. If nobody wants to hold the currency, they want to get rid of it and buy real things that'll hold their value more than the paper currency will. And yet we're on this course to have so much government debt that I think it's virtually inevitable that the government's going to have to print a whole lot of dollars to finance the debt. The question is, at what point do people just say, this is ridiculous, and they get out of the dollar? You get a hyperinflation, you get an economic collapse. And what tends to happen during economic chaos? Dictatorship. Somebody comes along riding the white horse, coming to the rescue. Do what I say, folks. I'll restore order, and I'll take care of it. The government will take care of you. Well, it's the government that caused this mess. So, pardon me, but I have a few doubts about that kind of a promise. But that's what we can kind of expect, I think. You see it already. I mean, you've got these people who want to manage every corner of our lives. They don't want us to use gas stoves. They don't want us to use internal combustion engines in our cars. They want to redesign, everything from food production to housing to the way business is done. I mean, you got people who just want to be in control. And sadly, economic chaos is often it opens the floodgates to tyrannies. You could have an economic depression if we allow a chain reaction of debt defaults. We had those banks fold recently, Silicon Valley Bank and the other one. Those were a combination of policy errors. Part of it was they got caught holding long-term, short-term interest rates were higher than long-term interest rates, and so they got caught there. But they didn't have any professional risk managers on their staff. The auditors should have caught that, and they didn't. But then the government, under Treasury Secretary Yellen, just unilaterally abrogated the law. There were insurance for small depositors, those up to $250,000. You had some of these multi-millionaire tech entrepreneurs. They would lose millions if the bank fell. Okay, so millionaires go broke. Well, it's not the end of the world. Instead, they got bailed out and used up most of the FDIC's insurance fund, which means banks are going to have to raise fees that, guess what, you and I are going to get to pay. We've had this pattern. Instead of letting debt get liquidated, that's painful. Companies go broke, people lose their jobs, but then the factors of production get picked up by another entrepreneur for a more profitable venture. It's the growing pains of the creative destruction of capitalism. But it's a natural process. It needs to happen. If a company is just losing money and the only way they're staying alive is getting a cash infusion because of ultra low interest rates, that's retarding economic progress. It's better to let them go broke. And yet what happens is we have this bailout mentality. Every time there's a crisis, bail them out. Don't let anybody go broke. Don't let them go broke. And yet going broke is part of the necessary healing process. I liken it to forest fires. You know, we had our family went out to Yellowstone in the summer of 1988. I had this wonderful vacation planned out. And unfortunately, we got there in August when half the park was ablaze with a big fire. Why such a big fire? Because for decades, the policy had been extinguish all the little fires. Don't let the old brush and the old growth get cleared out, which is what you let a healthy forest do. You get more renewal that way. And so you keep putting out these little fires until someday you end up with this catastrophic fire that's just too big and nobody can put it out. Well, it's the same thing in the economy. If you don't let businesses go broke periodically and you just keep them propped up, eventually the day of reckoning is going to come. And the more you've kept this dead wood around, the bigger the conflagration, the economic conflagration is going to be when finally the chickens come home to roost and there isn't enough capital out there. People aren't earning enough to pay off the debts. So what's the bottom line here, folks? I'm going to use kind of a harsh term, but I think it applies. We've cannibalized our future. We've laid an unpayable debt burden on the backs of our children, and they know that. You hear a lot of young people say, "Oh, Social Security isn't going to be there for me." They can see the writing on the wall. Another thing, we adults have done a very poor job of replenishing our own population. You know, it used to be families, you'd have kids hoping that they'd take care of you in your old age. Now we expect government through Medicare and Social Security to take care of us in our old age. So we haven't had as many kids. And it's like, wait a minute, the way Social Security is set up, you know, the funds come out of current earnings. Well, guess what? We don't have enough workers. That's why Social Security is going broke. We don't have enough workers at current tax rates to generate the revenue that's going to be able to fund all the promises that have been made. And I think a lot of it is we've shot ourselves in the foot. We said, oh, we don't need kids. The government will take care of us. But who's the government? Government's just this institution that has to get funds from somebody. So we've got this population implosion that is lurking. The only thing that'll keep our population from really imploding is immigration, because domestic birth rates aren't high enough. And some of it's quite tragic. There was a survey in the Wall Street Journal just a couple of weeks ago, a decline in patriotism, a decline in religion in America. And one of the findings that I found most disturbing was only 23% of American adults under the age of 30 think having children is important. Well, we talked a little about the economics of the future. How do you have a future? The first thing you need is, for a social future, you need people. And we're not having enough people to sustain the system, the political system and financial system that we've put in place, which means that the system is going to be reformed, perhaps quite radically, maybe quite painfully. But it's just really a shame what we've done to our kids, and a shame that we haven't had more kids. There's just a lot of economic pain ahead, and I think the key question is going to be a fundamental decision. Do we think that the government has the capability of taking care of us economically, or should we take our chances with the free market, which is what led to such American prosperity and growth for the first couple of centuries in our history? I'm a believer in the markets. but a lot of people aren't. And if you have financial chaos and social chaos, there's going to be a lot of fear. And when people are afraid, they don't always think clearly. And I am concerned that a majority of Americans are going to beg some dictatorial tyrant, somebody, please come in and take care of me. So let me just close by saying, remember, 2 days ago was Easter. Okay, that was kind of a gloomy message I gave you tonight. And it's always a little debate I have with myself. Should I do that? But I think we have to face up to these problems. But let's know that Americans have always had this ability, this resilience, heroes coming out of nowhere. And of course, we have a savior. There's a good God in heaven. So I'm not saying we're doomed. I'm just saying we're severely challenged. So let's roll up our sleeves and get to work. And with that, my semi-prepared remarks are over. And if anybody has a question, I guess I'm supposed to be in charge of that tonight. Just unmute yourself. Please introduce yourself, unmute yourself, ask me a question.
I have a question. We hear a lot about term limits as a way to possibly solve this problem. I'd just be curious about your thoughts on that. That gets a little bit more into the political realm, but we've seen what a rubric of bureaucrats can do, and is that maybe the absolute antithesis of what we need in terms of public policy that impacts economics.
Okay, I wasn't sure. Did you say term limits? You said you started off saying
yes, term limits, sir.
Term limits? Yeah.
Yeah, we hear a lot about that solving the problem because you get the perpetual statesman in, but with the rise of the bureaucracy, what's your thoughts kind of from an economic standpoint? Because this could, policy standpoint, but
yeah, it makes sense to me. Like I said, politicians have short time horizons. The next election, if they know that when the next election rolls around, they're going to be out of office, maybe, just maybe, some of them would do the right thing for the long term instead of focusing on the short term. So I'm comfortable with the idea of term limits. At the same time, I wouldn't get overly optimistic. I've got an article partly written about the state of our bureaucracy. The bureaucracy, or the swamp, as President Trump called it, it's real. These people are deeply entrenched. And the tragedy is, for our Republican small r system of government, the bureaucrats in any given year will promulgate far more rules than laws that our Congress will pass. They have the force of law, but they were put together by these unelected bureaucrats. I have a photograph that I hope will get printed in the article. I think it's going to be in the Epoch Times, of a bookcase with 3 rows of just piled 4 feet high of thin paper with small print, all the rules that the federal bureaucracies promulgated in a single year. And on top of the cabinet, there's a little stack about this high of similar paper. Those were the laws that Congress passed that same year. So I wish we could get term limits in the bureaucracy. No, I think we have to abolish a lot of these bureaucracies. They just, the Constitution says nothing about agriculture, education, energy, transportation, any of this stuff. Just the government, we've bureaucratized and institutionalized all this government intervention, and all it does is waste money, add burdens, introduces inefficiencies, leads to arbitrary rule, and it is unconstitutional because we're living in obedience to rules that were promulgated by people that we did not elect. So in some ways, we have a very undemocratic system.
May I ask a question?
Yeah, please do.
Even if the debt ceiling is not raised, would we not have enough income every month to pay our bonds and bills off and just discontinue certain services?
That's the bridge nobody wants to cross in Washington. I think technically you're probably right. And I don't know, when it gets to the technical aspects of this whole debt thing, I mean, my eyes just glaze over. I mean, I know that the politicians will do their dance and then they'll end up raising the debt ceiling. Again, I think you have to ask if it's realistic politically to have any elected leaders say, hey, we're taking this firm stand, we'll just pay off the bonds, but you guys that were counting on these other payments from us, you're out of luck. That's, to me, that's real life, but Washington isn't real life.
Do you think that it would be possible ever for the Congress to pass a bill that stated that you would decrease the federal workforce by attrition X amount per year?
I would love to see that. I might even modify that. I would like to see a president come in with a Congress that would back him or her up and eliminate one of the federal departments. And I'd probably go after agriculture. I mean, maybe because it starts with A, it's beginning of the alphabet, but it's been around longer than most of them. And right from the start, I think it's just been a kind of a barnacle on the economy. I mean, I mentioned about Roosevelt and his spending in the 1930s, and they'd hire people to drive around and count up how many acres farmers were planting. Well, you don't need to do that. I mean, the market works out supply and demand, but you see they were giving subsidies for not planting, and so they had to monitor it to make sure somebody wasn't cheating and putting more acreage in, into tillage than they were supposed to. But all we were doing was paying for a bunch of spies. We weren't paying for anybody that was doing anything productive. They weren't adding to the wealth of the country, they were subtracting from it. And most bureaucracies, I mean, look, if they add wealth, then a private concern can take over that function. I mean, if it's something that the market values, you can make a profit from it. So you don't need it subsidized by the government. So I'd love to see not only what you're talking about, an attrition of the federal workforce, the shrinkage of the federal workforce, but I would love to eliminate an entire department, because I think the lesson that people would learn in the aftermath of that step would be, gee, we got rid of a whole department and the world didn't come to an end. It's like right now, there's this mentality that these things are inevitable. The government bureaucracies are eternal. And I'd just like to prove that they're not. And that Americans can get along just fine without them and save a whole lot of money. So I'm with you. I mean, I'd love to see some of these reforms. I don't see it being imminent, near term. I mean, I just don't see that. But I think that's a direction we need to look and move in.
Do you see any political leader on either side who would go forward and put that type of program forward?
That's a great question that I can't answer. I would think that any of the conservative political leaders out there, and I like some of these people a lot, but they still have to make sure that they're not so toxic that they can't get elected. I would think that any conservative harboring inside a desire to do the kinds of things that you and I are talking about here would be silent about it now. The time would be premature for them to come out and start advocating it. I don't think there's enough of folks that feel like you and I do that would make that candidate a viable candidate. So even if they would like to do what we're talking about doing, I don't think politically they can afford to come out of the closet, so to speak, and say, yeah, that's what I believe. I may be wrong, but that's how I'm seeing it right now.
Thank you very much for a wonderful perspective and presentation.
Thank you kindly.
It frightens me, but at the same time, it's reality.
Yeah. And, you know, again, let me refer to Clarence Carson's book, Flight from Reality. Political ideology is horribly, I don't know, it's hypnotic, it's misleading, it's deceptive, it's based on fallacies, it's based on dreams. And it's like, come on, let's just have some common sense. But you know, the old saying, common sense isn't common.
Hey, Dr. Hendrickson. This is Robert from the Institute.
Yeah, hey, Robert.
Hey, thanks for doing this. This series has been incredible. These 6 parts so far, and I know we're going to take a break over the summer, but we would love to ramp it up in the fall again. But so my question for tonight is, what is the national debt attached to? So, for instance, if we default on that, what would happen? You know, like if you don't pay your mortgage note for 6 months, the bank comes and takes your house. What happens to a country when they default on their debt?
I haven't given that a lot of thought, but it certainly doesn't disappear. What pops into thought here is Argentina. They've defaulted on their debt multiple times, but they're still, you know, a fairly prosperous society. I mean, not nearly as prosperous as they once were, but they're not, you know, Venezuela or something like that. Of course, we're a much larger economy, and the world is intertwined with our economy to a considerable extent. So we're talking about international convulsions, I'm sure. I guess, Robert, it's like any debt default. It hurts, but it's necessary. And I just think the tragedy here is that we've allowed it to get to the extent that it has, rather than just biting the bullet and letting these smaller corrections of debt defaults happen. I mean, when companies are bankrupt, they're bankrupt, and they should be allowed to go out of business, you know, and let those resources that they're using be used by other entrepreneurs for more profitable usages. So the people holding treasury debt would all of a sudden find their net worth a lot lower than it was, because it would be worthless all of a sudden. If we have a hyperinflation, our currency is worthless. That's scary. Then you're starting from ground zero. I remember in Econ 101, when I do my lesson on money, and I did, you know, I've done one here in this series. I can't remember if I referred to it, but I would always show the class a photograph of German citizens putting armfuls of currency into their stoves to get a couple of hours of heat, because the currency was so worthless as currency. It was worth more to the holders of that currency as fuel for a fire. So somehow they pulled out of it. I mean, there's a lot of hardship, probably even going to be hunger, increase in homelessness, civil unrest. I mean, people are going to be scared, but we'll get through it somehow. I don't have enough of a crystal ball to give you a clear path for how we would do that. I apologize for that.
Right. I like in my office above my desk, I think I have a $1 million bill from Venezuela just thumbtacked into, you know, it's worthless. It's worth more as a piece of art than it is currency. But so my concern would be, so if we defaulted, there's nothing in the global economy, or there's no global courts that say, okay, now you lost the entire West Coast to China holding this debt. We're not in danger of losing land or anything like that.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think so. I think we'd tell the Chinese to go pound sand. I feel like I got long limited time tonight, so
are the prior
Go ahead.
are the prior lectures that you have given available online for those of us who have never seen these before?
My understanding is that they've got a couple of them recorded. We weren't set up for all of them, and I felt a little badly about that because I think a couple of the early ones were pretty good.
Is this one
Yeah.
recording?
Yes.
It is.
Yes. And the previous one on money was recorded. You'd have to ask Robert or Aaron or one of the staff people there at the Institute for Faith and Freedom exactly which ones. I don't know.
Thank you.
Sure.
I know we have this one and last month's. I believe that we might have the month before, so we may have 3 available. We're kind of still in discussions on what we're going to do with them, and it's 100% not because of the content. It's 100% because of the quality of Zoom. It's just when we record this like this, sound is sometimes an issue and things like that. But I mean, we do have private links for them. So if anybody is interested in seeing the ones that we have, you can email me. My email is pretty simple. It's my last name, Ryder, RIDER, and then my initials, RA. So Ryder, RA, the @ symbol, gcc.edu. And if you email me, I'll ship you the links to the ones that we have. And Mark, I'm going to sign off. Yep, sure thing. Mark, I'm going to sign off. But once again, thank you for this. This is priceless. This is invaluable. Your knowledge, your expertise, your gentleness in explaining this tonight was pretty hard. But I don't want to jump off the top of my house. I do want to think about it and have further conversations. So thank you very much.
Sure. Could I answer the question? I see a hand up, somebody with the initial G. Do we have time to take one more question?
Oh yeah. You can talk as long as you want, but I've got 4 kids. I got to get them ready for school.
Okay, Robert.
All right, see you. Yep.
Okay, G, ask your question. I don't know. I think it's Gary Roberts. Well, the hand's gone now. I had somebody raising one of those yellow hands. This Zoom signal. I guess I thought it was the to ask.
It looks like Gary does not have audio hooked up. So if he's trying to figure that out, I bet on his end right now.
Well,
okay.
Maybe it was my hand that was up. It's Ryder, RA at
GCC, Grove City College, GCC.edu.
Okay. Ryder, RA though, right?
RI.
Yes, correct. Ryder, RA. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
No, Dr. Hendrickson and whoever that was, it's Ryder is RIDER.
Yes.
Oh, thank you.
I actually have a question. So I know one of the things recently that has been coming up is kind of what's been deemed by some economists as the return to Keynesian depression economics. So, as a result of the 2008 recession and some of the COVID situation, I know the two main proponents right now obviously have been Paul Krugman and Robert Reich. Do you think there's element of truth that there is a push to a return to Keynesian economics in the sense of like just the current situation, or do you think there is somehow there could potentially be a return of, say, Austrian economics when it comes to, say, the capital theory?
A little background information. Keynesianism was discredited in the 1970s by stagflation because the Keynesian theory was that there was a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. That if one went up, the other would go down. And all of a sudden in the 70s, we have stagflation. We got both high unemployment and high inflation at the same time. So Keynesianism sort of went into retreat. It went underground, but it stayed the standard neoclassical economic paradigm taught to generations of college students. And so when some economic hard times have arisen more recently, you've got politicians just looking for some sort of intellectual rationalization to spend more money, because the money is, of course, what gets the politician elected, spending the money. So they kind of resurrected Keynesianism, I don't think out of any conviction, but simply as a pretext, as an intellectual sheepskin, as a justification for what they were doing, even though it was disproven. But they had to have some theory to fall back on, so it's Keynesianism. Austrian, wouldn't I love it if the world embraced Austrian economics? It's a very lonely path in the economics profession, because only a small percentage of us adhere to the Austrian tradition. Unfortunately, the Austrian position, it speaks truth to power, and power doesn't like to hear the truth. So they keep giving awards. You mentioned Krugman and Robert Reich, and I think Jesus said, "Oh, they have their reward." They're the voodoo doctors justifying what the political malpractitioners want to do to us. And I'm sorry, that's on the harsh side, but that's just the way the world seems to be. In politics, there aren't a whole lot of rules. They play hardball, they play for keeps, they play for money, they play for power. And if invoking Keynes gives them a little bit of an aura of justification that maybe they know what they're doing, they'll cite it. But Keynesianism has been disproven historically. So, I think its value is somewhat limited, certainly as a policy control. And, Keynes's idea, his famous statement, "In the long run, we're all dead." I think we're getting very close to Keynes's long run when we've got 31 trillion of debt and a president who wants to get it up to 48 trillion in only 10 years. I don't think I just don't see that being possible. If it is, I think it's going to be accompanied by, severe inflation or something else. So the Keynesian long run, I think, is upon us. Keynes was a mystic when you get right down to it. His theory was deficit spending to get the economy going. Now, the traditional economics is you produce before you consume. Something has to come into existence before anybody can buy it, right? But also, this is called Say's law. Jean-Baptiste Say, S-A-Y, was a French economist who was roughly contemporaneous with Adam Smith, writing in the late 1700s. And Say's law is, that production comes first, and it's what you produce, the value you produce is what gives you the economic wherewithal to buy things. You're trading essentially the output of your labor for the output of other people's labor. And that has to come first. Well, Keynes reversed it. He said, all you got to do is borrow money and spend it, and then boom, magically, you'll just have more production, more wealth. And he actually had the gall to write in some journal in the 40s, "We have perfected the art of turning stones into bread." All you have to do is borrow money and spend it, and you get wealthier. I don't think so. Anybody else, or should we just call it a night?
I could ask you questions for hours, but I would not do that. Thank you.
Okay.
I do have a follow-up question. So like that is one of the things that currently some of my economics courses have been talking about, is kind of the whole, return of Keynesianism. But do you also think to some degree there can be, say, a monetary policy explanation, say like Milton Friedman, and kind of how the monetarists would argue about, say, the natural rate of unemployment, and some of their talks of income and price policy?
The Chicago School, which is what monetarist economics is most closely identified with, they've done a lot of good work explaining free markets. Their monetary policy per se isn't exactly free market, but Milton Friedman's theory was, we'll just have a steady, slow increase in the supply of money, and at least you won't have these ridiculous gyrations that you get from Keynesianism. So I would say at best, it's the lesser of two evils. I don't think they're ready to embrace market money. Let the market decide what money is. In other words, repeal legal tender laws. I don't think these Federal Reserve notes in our pockets would hold their purchasing power if it weren't for the legal tender laws. But you need to have free choice of money and a free market in money. Just to repeat something I'm sure I must have stated in the previous lecture, money is it's what Ludwig von Mises, the Austrian economist, defines as the most marketable good. And so many goods in the market, I mean, look at flat screen TVs and computers and cell phones, they just keep getting better and better and better. You would think our money would get better, or at least hold its value, but the money that we use is of very poor quality if you want money to hold its purchasing power. Why is it that the most important economic good, or the most used economic good, gets worse in quality while other market goods get better in quality? Well, it's because they are market goods. Our money is not a market good. It's a government mandated currency. Big difference. So the Austrians are more radical, and they want to get to the fundamental idea of freedom. You don't need a central authority telling you what is money. Let people choose what they want to use as money. The market has always provided what, well, that's an overstatement, but the market does a darn good job over the centuries of providing what people want and need, and things that work well. That could work for money too, if you gave it a free market. We don't have a free market. I don't think the monetarists are ready for a free market in it, or advocating it explicitly. Maybe some of them are. Like I say, they're an improvement over Keynes, but they're not completely Austrian.
Mark, this is Don Smith. I'm a little curious about this digital currency that's being promoted, and I don't know if they're actually going to implement this digital currency right now, but what's the impact of this digital currency? What should we be looking out for in regards to that, and how does that impact our debt, our economic future at this point in time?
Okay, a couple of points there. First of all, obviously the government would impose this. So again, we're not talking about a market-based currency. We're talking about government fiat. This is what you people are going to use. The big danger that I see is that it basically would enable the government to keep track of everything you buy. It's a kind of currency that would be much more expected in communist China, where the Communist Party wants to keep tabs on the citizens. It would be a control mechanism. So highly dangerous. What it would do to our debts, Don, I don't know. I mean, basically, I guess the government would say to people, look, this is the currency now. You can use it or walk away and suffer a loss. And so maybe as a choice of lesser two evils, you know, some of our debt holders are, okay, all right, looks at that, maybe it'll work out and I can exchange it for something of value or whatever. But it's definitely a threat to our freedom. And I mean, only people who are more impressed than I am with government competence would be in favor of such a currency being imposed by the government.
I hear you.
Well, folks, I see we're just about at 9 o'clock. So bless your hearts for hanging in there an extra half hour tonight. I had no idea that it would stretch on this long, but I appreciate your attention. I appreciate the intelligent questions. And I want to leave you on a positive note. You know, we're Americans. We've got a wonderful God in heaven. We have a wonderful Savior. And you know, if you haven't been to the campus of Grove City College recently, if you ever want to feel good, go to the campus and mingle with the young people there. I mean, there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic about the future of this country. We're definitely going to have to correct some stupid policies. There's no doubt about that. It's not always going to be easy, but boy, we got some good people. So let's keep a positive thought about America's future. And with that, good night and God bless.